Hello, this is Mark Tucker with the next APL Components video for viewers of the Dabble Lab channel. In this video, we will learn about the Sequence and GridSequence components. We're covering both because they are so similar. If you want to follow along in APL Ninja, look for the project link in the description. Here we go. Back in Lesson 5 on data binding, we learned about multi-child components. And there we used the container and set its data property to an array of items, and then set the first item, items, and last items properties with different components. That items component was then repeated for each item in the data array and used data binding syntax for the child to then show the different information. Today we're going to do the same thing with sequence and grid sequence, and we'll be using the data and the items properties here. If we look at the sequence component, it says that it's used for repeating components and it's similar to the container, but the sequence has better performance for long lists, but the trade-off is less flexibility in the layout model. The properties that we get on sequence are the following 5. Numbered, which we saw before, which gives us that ordinal data binding child property. On scroll, which we covered quite a bit in the last lesson when we talked about the scroll view, so we won't be covering it today. Preserve, scroll direction, and snap. So scroll direction, we can have our list, and in the case of a sequence, it's going to be, if it's horizontal, it'll be a single row of values, or if it's vertical, it'll be a single column of data items being repeated. If we go to this grid sequence, also very similar. It talks about it being more performant but less flexible than the container. And the difference between it and the sequence is that it lays items out in a grid. So 2 new properties on the grid sequence that we'll see is child height and child width, and then those 5 same properties that we saw on the sequence. So let's go and jump right into the code here. The first thing you'll notice is that we have Alexa styles defined because we're going to be using some resources from that file that includes some spacing for our components. There's 2 layout components defined, child 1 and child 2, and we'll talk about what that means and why I went that direction on this sample here. But jumping into our main template, we've got a parameter for payload, which is going to relate to our data section. Here we have a single property called list, which is an array. And it has 2 strings. One is an emoji showing like some food item, so pizza, hamburger, and a title, and we have 15 of those items here. So our main template has our typical container component, and we'll turn on component highlighting, and that's going to take up the whole viewport area. And it has a single item, which is the sequence component, and it also takes up the entire area, 100%, and it has the numbered property true, and that's why we get to see ordinals here, and the scroll direction defined. And this is where we're using the styles for padding. So we're getting some space here for the margin on the left and right, and smaller spacing here on the top and bottom. Here's the data binding property, the data property using the payload list, and that's why we're going to get multiple items based on that. And then right now we're saying display child 1 in this component. And so you can see here there's that margin and spacing, and each of these items are just repeating of child 1 with different data values based on our data array. So let's just take a look at the different options here for vertical and horizontal, and before we dive into the child component. So on this parent component here, it's a sequence, and we're listing it vertically, and this is a a typical way that you would see it. It's kind of a longer. It's taking advantage of the wider width here on this screen by just laying things out here in a row, and that works just fine. And you can scroll up and down, just things like we did with the scroll view. The mouse will. If we were to change this though to instead of vertical to horizontal, that's when you notice that this particular component isn't necessarily great for this layout. We could maybe do some things with the width so it wasn't taking up the whole width, but it's still not as nice of a format for vertical for horizontal as compared to vertical. So that's why we have this child 2. It's the same type of data, but it's laid out in a different format. So we've got a bigger image here on top, and then we have a row that has the item number and the title, and we can scroll back and forth with that. So that's what we get with the grid sequence, a single row or single column, depending on if the direction is horizontal or vertical. And let's see what we get when we do a grid sequence. So grid sequence right now, nothing is showing because we need to specify the child height and child width. Here we're saying that it's going to be 45, the height's going to be 45%, so that's where we get two rows here, and the width is 25, that's why we get 4 across here. So notice it's grid sequence set to horizontal, and notice that the numbering is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but that's where we get the horizontal scrolling back and forth here on that. 2. Now, if we change the direction back to vertical for this, then notice that the numbering is going across 1, 2, 3, 4, like this, and the scroll direction is vertical, but you still get this, take advantage of this layout where you get to see multiple items in a grid. So that's what we're dealing with here. Let's go switch back to the sequence and change this back to child 1, because we're going to dive into these individual items and how things are laid out here. The reason why I chose to use a layout and just have a single child here was that it just made this code look nicer and pointed out the fact that you've got some data and some child component that you're using, and that's what the thing that's being repeated for each of the data items. So if we go up here to the layout section, all that is doing is saying we could take the same block of code that was this container and everything that's underneath this child here, and we could have copied it and pasted it right back into here, and it'd work just the same. And that's all it's really doing is we're going to define a new component which wraps a number of the other components that we've got, kind of makes them into a self-contained, repeatable component. So in this case, it's only being used once and being repeated multiple times because of the data binding. So let's take a look at this component here. So we've got child 1 container is going to take up the whole width and only a height excuse me, of 100. It's laid out in a row because we want this item, we have item 1, the picture and the title laid across out here in a row, and that's why that container is set to that. We can see that there are those 3 different components here. So here's the frame. We just set the width and the height and the radius to give us a circle, and then that frame has a single child, which is the text, and we're using that ordinal. And because this child is contained in the sequence, and because of data binding, this child component has a property which is ordinal, and that's why we see that number off to the side there. The next thing that we want to look at is this next section is also a frame, but it's set to square frame, and we've got just the outline instead of the fill. and we specify the height and the width of that item, and it has a child text component with the width and height taking up the whole space. And we bump up the font size of that text, and we're using data binding. So the child has a data property, data.symbol, which maps to our data.symbol here, and we'll see data.title here in just a minute. So that's where that is, and then the third item is just a text component, and it's got data.title set on the text. So that's how this component works and lays out this way. So let's switch this to back to grid sequence. Come on. There we go, grid sequence. And we're going to change this to child 2. There we go. And let's take a look at that component. So we come up here to child 2. And here's a container, and we specify what the width and height of that container is and its items. Because we didn't specify the direction, then the default is column, and that's why we get a column of values. The first item, the second item, first item being the frame with the text in it, which is the emoji, and so we'll take a look at that. Here's the frame. We've just made it bigger and fit the text inside of there, and there's the symbol. And then the second item is a container laid out in a row, so we've got the frame and the title next to each other. So here's that frame, same type of styling, just a different size for this child component, and it's using the ordinal and the data.title. So that's all there is to this example with scrolling. The last thing I want to show you, here we'll turn off component highlighting, is this property here called snap. Now let's change this back to sequence. All right, so here, if you notice that when you scroll, you can see this scrolling, and it just kind of stops, glides to a stop. Now watch. When I change this to force snap, I'm going to do the same thing, and it's going to kind of glide to a stop, and then at the very end you'll see like a little snap as it snaps in place. So let's try this. So here we go. We're going to kind of glide to a stop, and oh, there it goes, snap. Try it again. Snap, glide, snap. So depending on how much space it has, glide, snap. Then you can see that it'll either move up or down to kind of snap to where it thinks it needs to be. So that's kind of what you get for the snap property. So in this episode, we learned about the various ways to display data in either a sequence or grid sequence component, and reviewed what we learned previously about data binding and multi-child components. We also saw an example of how to simplify the main template area by using a layout. In the next video, we'll look at the pager component. I hope this video was helpful. Please let me know with a like or a share. Thank you for watching.